Welcome to Fintech Daydreaming, the podcast that dives into the world of banking technologies and the ever-changing landscape of fintech companies. We bring you real-life examples from global and local thought leaders, as well as experts working within the financial industry, and seek out the best stories from the front lines of financial services innovation, where dreams of industry pioneers meet reality. Hosted by Krogdahl and Ville Sointu. This is Fintech Daydreaming.
Hello and welcome. My name is Ville Sointu and I will be your host today of this episode of Fintech Daydreaming. I am, of course, as always, joined by my good friend and co-host, Paul Krogdahl. So, of course, I have to ask him, how are you doing today, Paul?
Better. The COVID is gone. The cough is almost gone. I'm feeling almost human again.
Oh, right.
I still can't go to the gym, right? The minute I go anywhere near the treadmill, my cough starts coming back. So I would like to say I'm on the mend, and I bet you now that means that I'll end up coughing all the way through this episode. But yeah. I'm feeling good. Good.
We
really disappointed with this horrendous weather we're having in Finland, but you know, I'm British. I'm entitled to complain about the weather.
I mean, we had a bit of a dramatic arc now here in the podcast. You know, we'll be following the development of your COVID. For better or worse, it seems like it's getting good now, and we can actually carry on a sentence without coughing, which is, of course, a good thing when you're doing a podcast, I would suppose.
Yes.
Very good. But enough about us and our COVID problems, and on to the topic of today, and our guest for today, who is a friend and colleague of mine from Nordea Bank, Mikko Hiekkataipale. Mikko is the head of fraud prevention solution management at Nordea. Mikko, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, and very glad that you invited me to your famous podcast.
Yeah, it's long overdue for sure,
yeah.
Because the topic that we're going to be talking about today is something that our audience is very keen to understand more about, and we get a lot of mentions with, and that's the Nordic identity space. But before we get into all of that, maybe a bit of background from you, Mikko. How did you end up where you are today?
Yeah, so today, kind of for the past almost a year, or actually more than a year already, I've been leading the Nordic product management team responsible for all the strong customer authentication solutions we use at Nordea. So it covers Bank ID Sweden, Bank ID Norway, NEM ID, MIT ID cooperation, and then the so-called Finnish Trust Network and the Nordea's own authentication solution. So that's what I've done for the past year. And before that, I was the local product manager for the Finnish part, so I know that quite well. So I've been working on this area, so with the Finnish Trust Network for past 6 years, and actually already before that, working on the operator side. So I have experience also on the SIM-based solutions and mobile ID, mobile legacy payments, so SMS payments and all that how does it work, and digital signatures and so on. So loads of experience and history.
Great. And I personally know that we definitely got the right person to talk about everything related to Nordic IDs and where it might be heading in the future. So really looking forward to an interesting conversation today. But we do have a bit of a meme going on, or let's say a tradition here in our podcast before we get to the actual topics, which is that we do ask our guests to do a fintech or banking related joke before we get to the actual good things. So without kind of putting any pressure on you, we tend to have really bad jokes by our guests and ourselves, the host as well. But Mikko, do you have a joke for us?
I have maybe few in mind.
Pick the worst.
One is enough.
Yeah, I'll pick the worst. So there was a kind of sunny day, and a guy was walking down the street looking surprisingly happy, and meet his friend there on the street, and then kind of the guy said, "What's up? That I heard that your fintech ended up in trouble with the banks and so on." And yes, that was the case, but no problem. It's history. Like, how is it so? Did you get some more money, or what's happened? No. Vice versa. That I just got a letter from the bank, and it told that it was the last reminder of the topic.
Wow, I think we have to bring you on for another episode, Mikko, because that was actually a pretty good joke.
Sorry about it.
Perfect.
So I'm wondering how many of our fintech listeners are now going, boo!
Yeah. Anyway, we seek to please our audience as always.
Yeah.
So here we go. So thanks for that, Mikko. Thanks for the icebreaker, and I think our audience really enjoyed that as well. But let's get on to the topic. Like I mentioned, the reason, or one of the reasons we wanted to have you on here, Mikko, today is to really talk about the thing that is the myth, the legend of Nordic identity, the digital identity schemes of the Nordics. I mean, both you and me, Mikko, we're from this region, so we've always kind of had this for almost like granted. And now that we've seen the world a little bit and heard experiences from around the globe, it's quite clear that the way digital identity is being used and it has been developed over the years in the Nordics is fairly unique. And I think it's an interesting reflection of the overall trust in the government and the ecosystem and infrastructure in general, and the way we have had democracies for a long time here. But maybe, I mean, let's start from the basics. So can you maybe, Mikko, since you're literally in the middle of this in your daily work, can you give our audience a bit of an overview of the landscape of Nordic identity schemes in different countries, how they might differ with each other, and what's out there effectively today?
Yeah, sure.
I don't mean to interrupt so early on in this, but I actually would like us to take one step further back, and maybe, Mikko, you can do that as well. We've made an assumption that our global listeners know what we mean by digital identity, and it's possible that they don't, right? We, in the Nordics, this is bread and butter for us. We're so used to it, but you step into the UK, you step to some other regions of the world, they're going to be sitting there saying, well, what is digital identity versus, other forms of identity? So maybe if you don't mind, if we could start there.
Yeah, that's a good point. As I said, I'm biased with this, so yeah. Mikko, I think you'll got this covered as well.
Yeah. So in general, kind of when I've talked to people outside of the Scandinavian miracle area, so it has been often considered that we have something in common. So one Nordic ID solution that all Nordic people can use to identify to different online services and so on. But that's definitely not how it is. But it consists of actually 4 different solutions, at least. So 4 mainstream, or not even solutions, but 4 different ways of doing or ways of operating strong customer identities online. So briefly, what it means is that the digital identity is a way for every Finn or every Scandinavian in a way or other to identify themselves both to banking, so they can do their payments online and so on, but also to wide range of public services. So you can fill up your tax reports, you can buy mobile subscriptions, you can buy electricity, you name it. You can do everything digitally there. And the basis is the digital identity. When it comes to the information, it's basically everywhere. It's that somebody proves what is your name and social security number. So the kind of unique identifier every Scandinavian has. That's the content of digital identity, but the kind of the big secret is that how it's managed, how we have trust among parties and so on, and how things just work in Scandinavia. Mm-hmm. And as mentioned in the beginning, there are many setups. So there is the Bank ID Sweden. That's one way of doing it. Mm-hmm. Then there is Bank ID Norway. The only thing in common is the name, but the completely different companies and different setup. Then in Denmark, there is the old NEM ID, which is now being in the middle of a big conversion nationally to MIT ID. And then there is the Finnish setup where all the Finnish banks have their own authentication solutions, but then these are governed in a framework called Finnish Trust Network. And this network is defined in the Finnish law and defined in the electronic identification part of it.
So then I've got a quick question to add on to that, trying to not be the smart guy in the room here like you two. I'll be the bit of the naive one with the dumb questions. So based upon everything you've said, I come along and I've got got my iPhone and I can log on to anything with my iPhone ID, right? And my understanding is that by doing that, Apple are authenticating me and saying that I am who I am without passing any of my personal identification or personal details onto the third party. Are we talking about the same thing, or is this slightly different?
It is different. So, for example, in Finland, when I authenticate myself to the tax authorities, it is actually part of the standard that the bank reveals part of your identity. So the official name and the official social security number, that's sent back to the service where you're identifying to. So it's kind of part of the thing that it's not anonymous in that sense, but it is really so that the recipient can know who you are, not just that you were the same person as last time, kind of. So in a theory, in Finland, your social security number can change, or your name can change. So it's always part of the authentication every single time.
Did you say can change or can't change?
Can change. No. Especially your name. Well, that's quite common, but yes, there are also cases that you might want to change your social security number. Yeah. Not very common, but anyway, it's possible.
Yeah, and as far as I've heard, it will be changing actually in the near future. But that's another
story.
Another rabbit hole. We won't get down to today. Maybe later.
Yeah.
And you talked about the fact that these digital authentication and identity schemes have been mostly built by banks. I mean, and even literally the solution in Sweden is called Bank ID. So what's the reason for banks? I mean, shouldn't government or like Apple or Google be doing this instead?
It's pretty much about history. So it's another surprise for non-Scandinavian is that how long we've been operating these services. So I think that Finland was the forerunner here, that in the late 90s, so it's basically before internet almost, the Finnish banks started thinking about strong customer authentications for their net banks. So Nordea was one of the first banks in the late 90s to launch their net bank or online bank. It was based on that you had a modem and you called to the bank and so on, but still it was online, it was digital. And that was the reason why we had to build also authentication solutions. And when that was done, well, it took some time that also other banks started to be on the same level, but still in the early 2000, late 90s, also the government started to have its first kind of digital services, and they then ended up having a trouble that, well, how do you recognize the customer? How to do it? The options were that you cooperate with the banks, or then government would have built their own setup. And actually what I've heard is back then, that is that the government really came to the banks that could we find a solution that they could actually use the bank's solution also in the governmental services, that let's not build two solutions. And then it started growing, and banks created the first famous Tupas protocol, which was the de facto standard for Finland authentication for 15 years or something like that. It worked well all that time, but still. So, but that was basically, so in the early 2000s, there was no Apple, or it was almost a bankruptcy kind of computer maker at that time. And there was no Google, there was, as I said, barely no internet, but still that was the best way forward. And then the authentication solutions were started to be built. And the same happened also in other Scandinavian countries. So Bank ID's history goes back to 2003. That would be the cooperative company between banks were formed, and then they started selling the authentication also to the third parties. And I guess also the same applies to Norway. That's roughly also early 2000 when Bank ID was formed. And Denmark was the late comer with NEM ID in 2010, I suppose, something like that. But still quite long time ago in all countries.
But then I've got another question for the two of you on this again, right? We're talking about the banks being the authoritative process behind this. To me, that's not very inclusive, right? That there is still a large population of the unbanked. I know in the Nordics, there's less than in other parts of the world, but there are still a demographic of unbanked people, which means that if you've got people that are unbanked, they're automatically excluded from this authentication process? How do they then authenticate for an online service to the tax authorities or to the government if the bank is the central authority on authentication?
Yeah, in Scandinavia, that isn't that huge problem, as you said. So it's actually defined in the law that to be able to use strong customer authentication, you must have a Finnish social security number, for example, in Finland. Same applies also to other countries. So you must be a citizen to be able to use it. So that makes it that you could say that it's close to your digital passport in that sense. You cannot get a passport unless you're a citizen.
Yeah. And
then also banks have different policies, for example, that how young people can open up a bank account. And of course, if you don't have a bank account, then you don't have the credentials and you don't have a digital identity from that point of view. So there are some holes, but I would say that the coverage is still 90+%. So, but if we think about the past 20 years, it hasn't been always so that kind of that 90% would even use digital services. So it has been gradually growing, the whole digitalization and so on. And it was only a couple of years back when the Finnish tax authorities stopped sending piece of papers to every single Finn, because they saw that, okay, now it's a minority group who doesn't do it. And then you can manually ask that, please still send me a piece of papers. But you're right. And that's kind of the reason why, for example, Finnish government at the moment has launched its own digital identity scheme and project that they don't want to start in a way directly competing and replacing banking in that sense. No, they want to fill up the holes that if you are, for example, a foreigner coming to Finland, you're a student coming to Finland, then you cannot get the current digital ID provided by the banks before you are a Finn. So then it's lots of papers and stamps and so on, but now the government can issue already the governmental ID, and they are responsible for issuing that one, and you can start doing already something digitally, even though you haven't visited Finland yet and so on. But this hasn't been a problem, or big problem at least, for the past 20 years. We know the problems, or we've known those, but still we have branches for these people that they can really go to or call the authorities and so on. But most of the people have been happy.
Yeah, I certainly remember my issues in getting a digital identity when I moved to Sweden earlier. It seems like it's almost like a chicken and egg problem, like you said. So when you go to a bank, they don't want to give you a digital identity because it's a strong commitment from them for allow access to all of these services that is enabled by the digital identity or bank ID in this case of Sweden. Now, and that relates to an interesting question, is that we kind of understand the mechanics. It's an authentication solution. You're effectively able to log in to trusted services, government services. You're able to sign documents and so forth. But technically, anybody could do this, right? So I could do a single sign-on with Facebook or Google or Apple, like we mentioned many times already here. But what's the difference if we take kind of one layer beyond that in terms of the trust and liability? So why is it stronger to authenticate with the bank authentication than it is with a merely technical authentication like Facebook?
At least nowadays, I would say that one big part, and that's how it has been in the past also, is the normal people's trust on the solution. And also that it is local, that you have local bodies you can build the trust on. It's still that there was a survey done maybe a month ago or so, that who do you trust in Finland? It was like 80-something% of citizens said that they trust the banks, but they don't trust advertisers. They don't trust kind of Facebook, Google, and this kind of bodies. So then it's also kind of, that's one part of it. But then that you are also a local player, then if something goes wrong, it's much more easy to deal with it. I bet everyone has had problems with the multinational companies and trying to get customer support, that if you have trouble with your Facebook account, then you end up having a discussion with hundreds of bots, but you never get an answer. But with Finland, all the banks, we have a best-in-class customer support. So yeah, we have long waiting times sometimes, like everyone does, I suppose, but still you get personal support. You can discuss with a real person there, you can manage the problems you've had. If you lost your credentials, we find a way, and still in the worst case, we can book you a meeting in a branch and so on. So the customer support really works, and that's part of the trust, I would say, from the end customer's perspective.
So trust is built on a local level. We've talked about that in the podcast as well. And then we need to start working on a broader reach and interoperability, which we'll get to soon in the next part of the conversation.
Yeah.
But
even in Scandinavia, if we think about the trust and setup, every country has a bit different ways of building it, bit different that who sells it, who is responsible for what. But that's just been built throughout the history through legacy, that these things just work, and it has been more easy to have it done locally, as you said.
Yeah. And then finally, before we move on to the next topic, I want to understand as well from the trust model. So when I am an institution that decides to accept that I will accept bank authentication to log into my solution, to accept it as a login solution or a signing solution for that matter. Now, what does it mean when I trust that signature from the bank? Do I get some kind of a guarantee from the bank? Is there a rule book behind it? How is it done from a trust standpoint beyond the fact that it's a local institutions that can be trusted? Is there some kind of a legislation behind it or something?
Yeah, it really depends on the countries, how it's in a detailed level. But for example, in Finland, it's defined in the legislation that to be able to be a issuer of a strong customer authentication solution in Finland, you must be part of this Finnish trust network. And before you can join Finnish trust network, there is actually governmental rules. So it's Traficom, the transportation and telecom authority, who is running the network or is governing the network, and it has certain rules and audits, and you have to pass and kind of prove that you know what you are doing when dealing with the people's identities in that sense. But the trust really, it's kind of it is governed partially in different laws. So for example, that if you sign a paper with Finnish credentials, we do the signature consists of a specific timestamp, your name and social security number, and who has told those, or kind of who is the issuer of the solution. But then if someone starts asking that, no, I didn't make this signature, for example, then the banks are forced to store all the log files and all the history data for quite some time, so we can at the end go back and prove against the customer that yes, someone must have done this because we have sent this token to you at this very specific moment, and we kind of collect the evidence that this is a solid and real signature in that sense. But I would say that it's the same way as when making with your hand, that you make your signature. You just have to trust it, and then if you don't trust it, then it's a tricky process for proving that yes, it was you in that sense. People just trust, again, people trust that it works. You can trust the banks, you can trust the authentication.
And ultimately you can, if you contest it, you can go to a court of law.
Yes.
And have that conversation from a legal standpoint. I think that's an important thing to make, especially when we've earlier had a lot of discussions about trust in the decentralized blockchain ecosystem, which is completely different as it's disconnected from the
and it's good
system.
that the country of going to the court is also defined, so
exactly.
that it's a Finnish service, Finnish guys, then you go to court in Finland. I don't know if you would use Facebook, would you have to go to San Francisco? Where would you have to start the court case to be able to say?
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
It's actually interesting what you said there, Ville, because I mean, it adds a whole new dimension onto the discussion around DAOs, right?
Or NFTs or any of it, or DeFi. So
you know, the whole notion of DAOs and being owned by not one entity but multiple entities. Once you start getting into proof of identity, etc., who is really voting, and you know, you've stored that the vote has happened, but have you really stored that it has been done by the right person under the right circumstances, etc.? So interesting future we're moving into with all of this.
Yeah.
But shifting gears, and let's get to all the future stuff later in the conversation if we have time. Hope we do. Otherwise, we're going to do 2 episodes on this topic. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, and this is especially interesting for the regions that might not have their solutions quite yet, which is that what are the, I mean, it's not a perfect world now, is it? So what do you think are the current weak points or maybe areas of development for different Nordic IDs? Is any of them better than the other? And how do you see the way forward in fixing those issues, if any?
Yeah, we actually discussed some of those weak points, like that not everyone can get a bank ID or bank credentials at the moment. So if you're a foreigner, yeah, you can get a bank account. That's defined in the banking law that every citizen must get a bank account. But still, to be able to use the e-identification, the strong identification, then you must have the Finnish social security number or Swedish social security number. So that's definitely one area of development. And same goes to the underage people, for example, that Nordea gives, if both parents approve, then also already quite young kids can get it, most likely before even, basically when they can type something, they can get it. Not all banks do it so kind of the government and the people, then you would have to choose your bank based on that who gives the e-ID the best way. And of course, government cannot kind of give this kind of recommendations that you're a bank Z customer, but you cannot get the e-ID, switch to Nordea and they will give it to you. Of course, they cannot say it. So it's not a kind of, it's not standardized that who is allowed to get the e-ID from the bank. And same goes to the authentication devices in Finland when we have the banks itself. This is not for Sweden in that sense, since it has its good things that there is just one national solution in bank ID. So then every bank, every citizen has exactly the same apps, exactly the same hardware and so on for authentication. But for example, in Finland, every bank is responsible for its own authentication solution it provides to its customers. And for example, we are one of the rare companies who have a hardware tokens for visually impaired customers, that we really have so-called talk device. So it's a code calculator which talks. The smaller banks don't have it, but again, if you happen to be their customer and you want to use e-ID, again, government cannot say that, you are a blind one, go to choose this or that bank as your main bank, other ones don't apply. So that's definitely one problem. Then part of it is at least kind of the, as mentioned, that who should really be responsible for the root identity also in the digital world. So in Finland and in everywhere else, as stated, it's bank ID, it's bank credentials. So everything is running on banks services. But as said, it starts to be closer to your digital passport. So maybe government should really have a bit bigger saying that who should be able to get it and somehow have way to control the system on their own. Currently, when it's banks operated system, at least in Finland, basically the only way government gets its voice heard is by writing laws. And that's definitely a not good thing. It has maybe worked in the past, but now when world is getting digitalized even faster than ever. We had the paper card for 15 years, and now we are kind of updating the solutions every 3, 4, 5 years and so on. And just changing the law takes normally several years. And if you change it every 5 years, that's already a rapid speed. So, and defining technical things in a law book by the lawyers is perhaps not the best way to do it. So that's what we've seen for example, in Finland with the Finnish Trust Network, that quite many semi-technical things are defined in law books. And then you interpret that, how you should interpret the law, and engineers try to interpret the law and lawyers try to interpret the technical specifications. So it ends up in conflicts, of course, that no, I interpret it that way and the other one interprets it that way. And then there is a lawyer in the middle. Well, the law book doesn't say which one of you is right. Can you talk with each other? Like, fine. So it slows down development in some areas easily.
Yeah. This brings to mind an urban legend that I must ask if this is true or not. Is it true that in Finland, the digital driver's license can only be shown by a government-built application by a specific government agency. Is that true?
That's what I've heard. I'm expecting the latest or kind of the future law proposal to be released actually next week or week after. Maybe that defines it more, but that's also what I've heard at the moment, that it's only a certain authority is allowed to release a driver's license, and that's why also the app where it's presented must be a government issued app. So yes.
Yeah, a great example of writing technology into law.
Yeah. And there is also some legacy kind of, the government tried to solve the digital identity in early 2000 by building a chip card. And they did build it. It cost quite many millions for the taxpayers, but the rollout of the chip card failed very bad. And it's kind of, there was a solution, but no one just wanted to use it. And then we still have the chip cards, but still no one uses it, but it exists. There is the chip card, and it has several PIN codes and nice specifications, but just no services where to use it, or at least, and to get the card, you have to pay 50 euros. Like, well, I get the credentials from the bank basically for free. Why should I pay to the government 50 euros to be use it in selected services? So kind of the productization of the chip card didn't go that well on the governmental side.
So I've got actually another question to both of you around the weak points. I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about whilst listening to you two talking through this, if we disregard countries or regions with corrupt governments for the time being, right? We're talking about identity being issued and managed by banks. Banks generally tend to be for-profit private organizations. Generally, we sometimes have banks that are state-owned, right? Which means that they're driven by profit. They're driven by shareholder value. And we're talking about managing identity of citizens. Shouldn't it therefore then make more sense that it is government-owned, government-managed, government-supported, rather than actually having your identity managed by a for-profit organization? It almost steps halfway towards the discussion we had about, your identity being managed by Facebook. The only thing that's different between Facebook and a bank, to a certain degree, is regulation. They're both for-profit organizations. What do you think?
I think you're partially right. So
okay,
kind of, so again, an example from Finland, you're kind of right. So banks were greedy. So in the early, kind of when the solution was created in early 2000 and so on, it started to ramp up. The banks had the control point and they really made money out of it. So one authentication back then was like in 2010, maybe 20 euro cents, which is huge amount if you think about today. Nowadays it's 3 cents. And that's all. In Sweden, it's even less. So we're start to talk about few cents, and the discussion is already going that should it be less. But really, on the other hand, I'm a bit doubt that the world would be better if government would have hosted the services from day one, because then it also lacks competition completely. So government then believes that we know what you want. Like the chip card, we know that you want a chip card with 2 PIN codes and you must have a reader and these drivers. Like, no, I don't. So, and it has taken quite a long time before they make mobile apps. And to think about the public sector services, well, in Finland, in Scandinavia in general, they start to be better already. So they have understood the value of having interaction designers and usability designers coding these services. But another joke from the kind of mid-2000, there was an authority who said that we are the first authority who have digitalized all the services in Finland, what they were kind of responsible for. And people are, no, you haven't. Yes, we have. We have every single form in PDF. Yeah, well, true, you have digitalized every single piece of paper you have, but is that really the target? Is that now the world is ready? So the kind of the expectations are quite different. So I think that the best result is achieved that you would have actually both. So and government and the banks or the private sector in general, they would support each other and talk to each other, share the vision and all this, and try to search for win-win-win use cases, and we kind of split the responsibilities that, okay, here is the problem, how to solve it best, and so on. And slowly but surely, I think we are heading that way, at least in some countries.
So let me use this public-private dynamic to try to build a segue to the next part of the conversation. And so if we look at the history of identity, or indeed the current state of identity in the Nordic countries, or at least in Finland, so there's almost like there's two kinds of identity. So you have your passport, which is issued by the police or the government. So you get that as a strong identity that you can use to travel abroad, and you can prove yourself identity in foreign and international scenarios. But you cannot really use your passport in a natively digital environment. Sure, you can take a picture of your passport, you can scan it with an NFC phone and things like this, but that's just digitalizing the passport rather than providing a strong digital identity online. And therefore, from a historical standpoint, now we are in a situation where if you become a bank customer in the Nordics, you take that passport or equivalent identification, you take that to the bank, who will then verify that and then create you a digital identity. So the root of the digital identity sits at the bank. So that is your gateway to digital services, and that's where we are today. But aside this chip card project that we just heard about, which seems to be a bit of a failure, we now know that the European Union is working on a digital identity scheme and to make this digital root identity a reality in the future. And Mikko, I know you're working with the European Digital Identity Program and its current phase of development. So maybe you could build this bridge a little bit more concrete. So how does this relate to the world of bank identification and digital identity in the Nordics? What is the connection between Europe and the current system in the Nordics?
Yeah. Maybe the connection started to building up because the regulation or the proposal given last summer stated that the eIDAS 1.0 in a way was a bit of a failure, and the EU ID should be the eIDAS 2.0, which would be usable also on the private sector side. So a bit of a history that the eIDAS 1.0 mainly has failed because for the same reason partially that the chip card failed in Finland, that there was no use cases for it. So why to use it? We're still
quick pause there, Mikko.
Yeah.
Brief explanation. What is eIDAS?
eIDAS is the European Union rule book for strong cross-border authentication. So that in practice, that if you have a strong and qualified authentication solution from Germany, for example, then you can use that device to authenticate to Finnish tax authorities, for example. But eIDAS 1.0 was only regarding public services. So there was no way that the government built their highways between different kind of information highways between countries, that you could really use the German card in Finland, for example. But then if you were a private company, you asked, could I use the same highway? No, you are not allowed. This is public only, stay away. How many times will you have had the urge to go to the Swedish tax authorities pages now when you live in Finland? Once in a lifetime.
Yeah, so maybe when I get to my pension sometimes and I need to collect something, but maybe that's the first time.
So then it really, the customers didn't worry about it. They didn't care about the cross-border authentication. If they happen to use it sometimes, then okay, there are some pensioners living in Spain 9 months out of 12 and so on. So they might want to use the Spanish ID in Finland, but it's a really, really small group. And quite often they actually have also Finnish bank accounts, so they can use those. So now when the EU ID is coming, there are also now use cases. It's expanded also to the private sector side, so that that you should be able to log in or authenticate yourself to a bank. You should be authenticate to electricity services and many other crucial kind of services within your country. And there are use cases like you should be able to prove your digital, that you are allowed to rent a car, that you have a driver's license, that when I go to Spain for holiday, I could do it actually digitally over the network. So it's growing in that sense. But how it will affect Scandinavia, that's a good question. I have a feeling that there are big country-specific differences again, that how big urge there is to develop these services. It seems like that my gut feeling is that Finland is maybe 1 to 2 years ahead of other countries in Scandinavia. It's partially because of the ADAS mentioned self-sovereign identity, for example, that it connects to my data and so on. So the basic work has been going on in Finland longer than in other places. And another reason is luck. So it's just by luck that the government happens to have their own digital identity program ongoing at the moment. So there is a 4-year project for that, and it just happened to get the governmental funding, and it happened to be at the right time, at the right place, and so on. So now they adapted their plans to meet also the EU ID plan, so that they really now have a roadmap that, okay, let's launch the national version first, and then let's think about EU ID and be ready for the next step and so on. Other countries don't have it. And the Finnish setup, for example, it has, as part of the deal, they are building that the government should have the root identity, that there is a cloud identity for every Finn eventually, not so that it just suddenly appears there, but when you, for example, issue for the passport the next time, perhaps it's generated at that phase and so on. So there was lots of fundamental work already ongoing when the EU ID was announced. Other countries didn't have this, and especially I think Danish people hate the whole initiative, that they are now in the middle of the ID change of a century. They have to issue MIT ID to 5 million Danes before next summer. So and the schedule is tight. The program is a bit late and in many fronts and so on. So I doubt they think too much about future at the moment. They think about that, how to keep the digital society open still after summer in that sense. So most likely then maybe later in a year or two they will start thinking about it. But this is definitely one part of the EU ID.
So sounds like a typical public sector project where you need to agree with a lot of parties, and it might be a bit of a rocky road to get everybody to agree on anything.
Yeah, and since we still lack lots of detailed specification that what are we really talking about, those are expected maybe after next summer, so so-called Toolbox setup. There are lots of different kind of interpretations that what is being built, and unfortunately there is a bit of a split that the Toolbox work, it's public sector only. Private sector should stay somewhere. It's public sector who defines everything. So then how to get the data that what's really happening, that's a bit of a detective work sometimes, and how to influence the direction so that not that stupid decisions are made in some technical parts, for example, and so on. So
yeah, but Mikko, you mentioned a big word there in the middle of your answer, which was self-sovereign identity, which is definitely a rabbit hole that we need to take on another episode. Or what do you think, Paul? Should we do an episode on self-sovereign identity, perhaps?
I think we absolutely should. Yeah, we did cover it to a certain degree when we had David Birch on as a guest, right?
Yeah,
but it's definitely an area I think we need to delve into, and I'd love to understand it from the fintech perspective as well, right?
Yeah, but from a European citizen standpoint, so it sounds like if everything goes to plan, and while it rarely does, let's fantasize for a second. So I should be able to travel to, let's say, Spain and get a local mobile operator subscription or even a bank account with my digital identity wallet that I have received from the Finnish government. Is that right?
As far as I know, yes. So that's kind of the go live date in the plans for that. Was it mid 2024 should be the first go live dates? But based on what I've heard, well, it might be true that we go live, but it's a bit of a kind of opinion what is go live. If you have two live, like if you're an operator, you have two live SIM cards in the world, are you live? Yes, you can make phone calls to each other, but it's the mass market adaptation for sure doesn't happen by mid 2024. So it will still take some time. And sometimes I'm good in predicting things, and I'm sure that in the near future we will see many hockey sticks that how EU ID and self-sovereign identity will conquer the world in 3 years' time. That in 2027, 70% of authentication will use this one, and in 2030 it's 100%. No.
Exactly.
I used to work at Nokia way back when near-field communication payments were done. And I still see that quite many people use plastic at the cashiers.
Yes.
So, and already back then, I saw every year the hockey stick curve going on that mobile will dominate the world. But no, people are kind of the common people, they are slow learners.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more, and I love what you talked about, the definition of a production or a live environment. I think we've seen that a lot in the technology space in general, but blockchain space in particular, from a personal experience. But time is running out, as we always say, time goes fast when you're having fun. But Mikko, I want to give you the opportunity. Did we forget to talk about anything that you wanted to mention before we round off the episode?
I think not. We have had a good discussion regarding the different aspects of this Nordic miracle, in that sense that maybe the listeners now have a bit better understanding that yes, it is a really good system we've had, and it has served the society for a long time. We don't have to prove our identity based on gas bills like in UK and so on. I guess, is that myth already broken? But at least that's how it used to be. But still, kind of, there is still work to be done, and the world is definitely not ready. But I just hope that in the EU ID work, and when we start to build a common European things, the stuff we know already, how things work, what should be done, the rabbit holes we've seen in Scandinavia, this kind of lessons learned should be listened quite closely in the work there. And I'm sure that the people are ready to and kind of happy to assist the authorities and so on, and telling how things work and how to make it work and what not to do and so on.
Absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure we will get a lot of questions and feedback for this episode. And I feel, Mikko, we might want to bring you back to answer some customer and indeed our listener feedback maybe. But again, it's been really, truly a great discussion. I think time really went fast this time, and there's going to be a lot of comments for this episode. I am certain of that. Now, we will round off this episode in order to keep it under an hour, at least a little bit under an hour. And Mikko, we always let our guests give the opportunity to tell how can people reach out to you and find you on different channels.
Well, I'm in LinkedIn, first name dot last name, just search from there. In the world, there is two Mikko Hiekkataipale, and I'm sure that you can recognize which one of them I am. Also, if you want to send email, it's first name dot last name at nordea.com. That works fine, and so on. Don't try to call me. I get so many sales calls at the moment that most likely if it's a private number or secret number, I won't answer to you. So email and LinkedIn is fine.
Yeah, it sounds like a common problem. I can't remember the last time I answered the phone when it wasn't a number that I recognized. But that's an identity problem we can talk about later as well.
Yeah.
So again, thank you, Mikko. Thank you, Paul. It's been a great episode, and we will round off now, which means that I have to remind you all that please, wherever you're listening, there is a subscribe button. If it doesn't yet say subscribed, please hit the button and make sure that you will receive all the Fintech Daydreaming goodness in the future as well. Beyond that, if you like the episode, if you like what you heard, please go on the platform of your choice, leave a comment, leave a review, 5 stars. The more stars, the better. 5 stars is perfect. And that helps a lot more customers and indeed listeners find the podcast in the future as well.
You're really getting hung up on this Fintech Daydreaming Bank thing, aren't you? Right?
Yeah, I am.
Customers and everything else.
Customers and listeners, and I have to know the difference. I don't think there actually is a difference. But anyway, that's another rabbit hole, which we will go to later. And this has been Fintech Daydreaming.
This is Fintech Daydreaming.